Most people believe that if a bear is following you, it means danger is near. But in one forgotten corner of the world, deep in the countryside, something truly unusual was happening. A massive mother bear refused to leave a farmer's side. Day after day, she sat close by, watching over him, never growling, never attacking, just waiting. At first, the villagers were terrified, but when they finally uncovered the truth behind her silent loyalty, they were left speechless. In a quiet village tucked between rolling hills and ancient forests lived a man named Elias. He was a farmer, the kind whose hands had known the weight of soil and seasons for over 60 years. His small wooden cottage stood at the edge of the woods, surrounded by golden fields and the whispering sounds of tall grass swaying in the breeze. From afar, his life looked simple, peaceful, and ordinary. But behind that stillness was a silence that weighed heavily. Years ago, Elias had a family, a wife whose laughter once filled the halls of the house, and a young son who used to run through the fields chasing butterflies. But one stormy evening, everything changed. A carriage crash on the forest road claimed both their lives. Elias survived, but something inside him did not. Since then, he had lived alone, working the land not out of joy, but out of habit. Each morning, he woke before the sun, fed his chickens, tended to his crops, and spoke to no one. His heart was a locked room, and he had thrown away the key. The villagers often watched him from a distance. They admired his work ethic, but they whispered too. Some said he had gone mad with grief. Others believed he had simply chosen a life apart. But no one dared to ask. Nature had become his only companion. Birds perched on his windows, goats followed him like shadows, and even the wind seemed to carry his sorrow through the trees. But even in his solitude, Elias felt something stirring. He had noticed strange signs around his property, footprints larger than any dog, broken branches bent as if by great weight, and distant eyes reflecting in the night. Still, he did not feel fear. Instead, he felt watched, not by a threat, but by something patient, something waiting. Elias did not yet know it, but his quiet life was about to be shaken, not by humans, not by tragedy, but by the most unexpected visitor of all, a creature born from the wilderness, one that should have been feared but would soon become the very heart of his story. It began with a set of tracks in the soft earth, large, heavy prints pressed deep into the soil just beyond the rows of corn. Elias stood at the edge of his field one morning, staring at them, his hands still dusted with flour from breakfast. The tracks were too wide to belong to any dog, too defined to be from a wild pig. They were precise, deliberate, each one leading out of the forest and stopping right at the border of his land. He examined the ground closely, his weathered fingers brushing over the marks. Whatever it was, had come close but hadn't stepped into the crops. Nothing was damaged, nothing was eaten. The animal had simply approached and then turned back. That night, Elias lay awake in his bed, listening to the night air. The usual songs of crickets and owls were there, but something else lingered too, a feeling more than a sound, as if something was just beyond the trees, watching. In the following days, the signs became more frequent. Each morning, new prints appeared, circling his field, sometimes coming closer to his house, but never crossing the invisible line between forest and farm. Once, he found a piece of fur snagged on a low branch, thick, dark, and coarse. Another time, a feeding trough had been nudged slightly from its place, but not overturned or broken. Whatever the creature was, it moved with caution, not chaos. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Elias caught his first glimpse. From the edge of the trees, just beyond the fence line, a large shadow moved between the trunks. It was slow, steady, and unmistakably massive. For a brief moment, he saw a pair of eyes catch the last bit of sunlight before disappearing into the brush. The size, the posture, the silence of its movement, it could only be one thing: a bear. Elias did not panic. He didn't rush to arm himself or call the authorities. Instead, he stood there, staring at the spot long after the creature had vanished. There was no growl, no sudden charge, no display of aggression. It was as if the bear was observing, just as he had been. A silent understanding passed between them, though neither had spoken nor moved closer. When Elias mentioned the sightings to a shopkeeper in the village, the reaction was immediate. The warning was clear: bears are dangerous, they said, especially mother bears. If she's nearby, her cubs might be too, and that makes her unpredictable. Some even urged him to leave for a few nights until she moved on. But Elias shook his head. He had lived on that land longer than anyone could remember, through storms, through winters, through heartbreak, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he did not believe this bear meant harm. The forest had always been close, but this felt different. This was not nature intruding, this was nature reaching out. Elias returned to his fields each day with quiet watchfulness, his eyes drifting more often toward the woods. The bear was there, he could feel it, not hunting, not hiding, just watching. The first true encounter happened just after sunset. The sky had turned a deep shade of gold, fading slowly into blue. As Elias stood by his porch, sipping from a metal cup, the day had been quiet and warm. He had just finished watering the last patch of vegetables when a strange stillness settled over the air, the kind of silence that made even the crickets pause. That was when he saw her. She emerged from the forest like a shadow taking form, a massive mother bear with fur the color of dark earth. She stepped out of the trees with slow, careful movements. Her head was lowered, her eyes calm. She did not growl, she did not move toward him. Instead, she walked to the very edge of his field and sat. Her front paws rested on the soil, her eyes fixed on him. Across the distance, Elias froze, cup still in hand. His heart beat louder than it had in years, not out of fear, but from something he couldn't yet name. The bear simply watched him, not like a predator watches prey, but as if she were waiting for something. The two stood in silence, one man, one beast, separated by a narrow strip of land in a strange, invisible trust. After a few minutes, she turned her head slightly toward the trees, then rose and disappeared back into the forest. Elias stood for a long while after she left, unsure if he had imagined it, but the tracks she left behind were real, large, deep, and still warm in the fading light. The next evening, she returned. Again, at sunset, again sitting at the edge of the field. This time, Elias remained seated on the porch, watching her as the wind played with the tall grass between them. It became a ritual. Each evening, she came, always the same distance, always the same calm presence. She never crossed into his land, she never made a sound. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern continued. Some evenings, she arrived earlier, standing quietly beneath the tall pine that marked the start of the forest. Other times, she waited until the stars were just beginning to appear. But she never failed to come. Elias found himself waiting for her each day, watching the trees with a mix of wonder and warmth he hadn't felt in years. He began to speak aloud while working, telling the air stories of his day, knowing somehow she was there, listening from the shadows. He didn't know why she came or what she wanted, but her presence began to fill the quiet space his family had once occupied. She was wild and untouchable, yet something about her felt familiar, as if she too had lost something long ago and had found, in this place, a small thread of peace. Elias no longer questioned her visits, he simply welcomed them. It didn't take long for whispers to travel beyond the edges of Elias's land. A young boy herding goats caught sight of the large bear one evening sitting near the farmer's field and ran home breathless. By morning, the entire village was buzzing. A bear, they said, had taken up watch near the old man's house. Some called it unnatural, others believed it was dangerous. The thought of a wild animal so close to a human and returning day after day unsettled many. By the end of the week, the village square was filled with speculation. Some believed Elias had lost his senses and was feeding the bear. Others insisted it was a spirit in disguise. A few even went as far as to say the bear was the very creature that had caused the tragedy in Elias's past and had now returned to finish what it started. Fear spread quicker than reason. Concerned neighbors began showing up at Elias's gate, offering warnings. A few begged him to leave his home and stay in the village for a while until the bear moved on. But Elias met their concern with quiet resistance. He thanked them but remained firm. The bear had never harmed him, she had never crossed the boundary. If she had wanted to, she would have done so long ago. Soon, the authorities got involved. A small team of wildlife officers was dispatched from the nearby town. They arrived in uniforms with trucks and equipment ready to track and relocate what they assumed was a dangerous animal. Elias stood at his porch, calm and unmoved as they explained their purpose. They wanted to set traps and monitor her movements. Elias listened politely, then shook his head. "She's not a threat," he said. "She watches, that's all. She's never come close. She doesn't destroy. She doesn't hunt near here. She just sits." But procedure had to be followed. The officers set up cameras around the area and left traps further down the path leading into the forest. For days, they returned, checking their equipment, but nothing ever appeared. The cameras showed empty fields and still trees. The traps remained untouched. It was as if the bear had vanished. But Elias knew better. She came each evening, as always, but only when the outsiders were gone. Somehow, she sensed the difference. She stayed hidden during the day and returned when the quiet returned. Elias began to believe she knew when it was safe. The village remained divided. Some believed Elias was under some kind of spell, that the bear had drawn him in with wild magic. Others believed he had simply grown too lonely and imagined the whole thing. But a small group began to wonder, could it be that the bear was there, not as a threat, but as a guardian? Whatever the reason, Elias would not be moved. He stood by the bear's quiet presence, as surely as he had once stood by his crops and his family. She was part of his life now, and he would not betray her. 10 years ago, the village had been different. The fields were greener, the roads busier, and Elias's life had been full. He was a younger man then, with a strong back and a heart that carried the laughter of his family. His wife Miriam was the warmth of the house. Her hands brought life to the garden, and her voice filled the air with song. Their son, Daniel, was just 5 years old, curious, bright, and always with a twig in hand, pretending it was a sword. Together, they were the picture of a quiet, happy life. That year, the rains came early. Dark clouds gathered and poured down on the land for days. The roads turned to mud, the rivers swelled, and the trees groaned under the weight of the wind. On the 3rd day of the storm, Elias had gone to the village to collect medicine for Daniel, who had caught a mild fever. Miriam had insisted on coming along, bringing Daniel wrapped tightly in a blanket. They had taken the old wooden carriage pulled by their trusted horse and vanished into the misty morning. Elias returned home hours later, alone, his coat soaked through and panic in his eyes. The carriage had lost its balance on the slippery forest road. The wheels slid sideways, and the horse reared, throwing them all down the slope. Elias remembered waking up in the mud, the rain pouring over him and the sound of silence pressing against his ears. He had called their names until his voice cracked, but the only answer had been thunder. Villagers found him wandering in the woods later that night, covered in cuts and bruises. They followed his trail back to the site. The carriage lay broken at the base of a hill, its wheels shattered, its roof split open. Miriam's body was found near a tree, her arms wrapped tightly around Daniel. Both had died instantly. There was no sign of the horse, no sign of struggle, just one strange detail that no one could explain. Near the wreckage, in the thick mud, was a single paw print. It was large, unmistakably belonging to a bear, deep and clear, as if the animal had stood there for some time. The villagers whispered about it for weeks. Some said the bear had attacked and caused the crash. Others thought it had come after, perhaps drawn by the scent of blood. A few believed it had simply been passing through. But the mystery never left Elias. He had often thought about that print, how it stood alone, surrounded by the chaos of that day. He never blamed the bear. In fact, he wasn't sure what he believed, but something about that print felt strange. It didn't speak of violence, it spoke of presence, like something had been there, watching. After the funeral, Elias changed. He spoke little and smiled even less. He buried himself in work, letting the seasons pass without notice. His home grew quiet, his table empty, but he never left the land. Still, it held their memories. The wind still carried Miriam's voice, and every so often, in the quiet of the evening, he thought of that single paw print and what it might have meant. He had no answers, only the ache of loss and a strange sense that something, or someone, had been there that day for a reason no one could yet understand. The summer sun was merciless that day. Heat shimmered across the fields, and the air hung thick and still. Elias had been up since dawn, tending to his crops, pushing himself harder than usual. He had barely touched his breakfast and had skipped his midday meal entirely. There was a stubbornness in him that refused to yield to age or exhaustion. His hands trembled slightly as he hoed the soil, his breath short and uneven, but he kept going, step by step, row by row, under the glare of the sun. By late afternoon, his vision had begun to blur. The world tilted, and his legs felt heavy, like stone. He paused, wiped the sweat from his brow, and took one last look at the field. Then, without a word or cry, he collapsed. His body crumpled onto the dirt, the tool slipping from his grasp. The earth rose around him in a soft cloud, and then silence. His chest moved faintly, but his eyes remained shut. From the edge of the forest, a pair of eyes had been watching. The mother bear had arrived, as she always did, just before dusk. But today, something was different. She saw Elias's fall and did not retreat, as she usually did. Instead, she moved forward slowly at first, then with growing urgency. Her large body crossed the field until she stood beside the man, motionless on the ground. She sniffed the air, then lowered her head close to him. There was no sound from Elias, no movement. The bear began to pace in circles around him, her steps fast and agitated. She paused, then let out a low rumble, a deep, vibrating sound that rolled across the land. When no response came, she lifted her head and let out a powerful roar that echoed into the distance, breaking the quiet of the fields. That roar reached the ears of several nearby villagers. Some were walking along the path, others tending to their own crops. It sent a jolt of fear through them. Bears did not roar without reason. Something had happened. Within minutes, a group of men and women arrived at Elias's property, breathless and unsure of what they were about to find. What they saw stopped them cold. The bear was standing over Elias, her head lowered, her massive body blocking the sun. She did not growl. She did not charge. Instead, she stood protectively, her eyes flicking toward the people with quiet warning not to attack, but to keep them from coming too close, too fast. One brave soul stepped forward slowly, arms raised. The bear shifted slightly, then moved back just enough to let them see Elias was unconscious but breathing. The villagers rushed in, lifted him carefully, and carried him toward the house. The bear watched every step, her body tense but still. Only when Elias was safe inside did she turn and walk back toward the forest, disappearing among the trees. No one spoke for a long time. The image of the bear standing like a guardian over the fallen man burned into their memories. Fear had no place in their hearts that evening. What they had witnessed was something else entirely, something sacred, something they would never forget. The story of the bear spread far beyond the village. After the incident in the field, people began arriving from nearby towns, curious to see the animal that had watched over a man like a faithful companion. Most only saw the field and the forest beyond it, never catching a glimpse of the bear herself. But one visitor stayed longer than the rest, not out of curiosity, but out of purpose. His name was Dr. Pavel Renner, a local wildlife biologist who had spent years studying bear behavior in the region. He had heard the rumors of a wild bear showing signs of loyalty and intelligence far beyond what was normally observed. At first, he dismissed the talk as romantic exaggeration, but the consistency of the reports, especially after the recent event where the bear had roared for help, convinced him to investigate further. Dr. Renner arrived quietly with a small camera and a notebook. He did not set traps or bring loud equipment. Instead, he camped at the edge of the forest near Elias's land and waited for several days. He saw nothing unusual. The bear did not appear, but he spoke to the villagers and to Elias, who told him everything he knew and remembered. There was something about Elias's voice, something still and honest, that made the biologist believe there was more to the story than legend. Then, on the fifth evening, the bear came. She moved out of the forest, as she always did, calm and silent. Dr. Renner remained perfectly still, watching from a hidden place near the barn. Through the lens of his camera, he studied her, and what he saw made his breath catch. On her front right leg was a faint but clear scar, a long, shallow mark that stretched just above her paw. The shape and position were unmistakable. That night, Dr. Renner returned to his camp and pulled out an old folder he had brought from his archives. Inside were reports from a decade ago about a bear sighting near a fatal carriage crash. One report from a forest ranger had described a bear limping near the scene days after the accident. At the time, it had been dismissed. No one had connected it to the tragedy. But in the report was a blurry photo taken by a hiker that showed a bear moving through the trees. Dr. Renner zoomed in on the image and saw the same scar on the same leg. His hands trembled slightly as he compared the images side by side, the size, the posture, the injury. It was her, the same bear from 10 years ago. He dug deeper. Old records from the rescue team noted a single paw print at the scene, one that stood alone near the bodies. No signs of an attack, no blood, no claw marks, just the print, as if the animal had come after the crash, not before. Dr. Renner reread every line, and something began to form in his mind, a theory that changed everything. What if the bear had come to help? What if she had witnessed the accident or arrived moments later and stayed watching as Elias's world shattered? Perhaps even then, she had sensed his pain, his loss, and had returned again and again, not out of hunger or curiosity, but out of shared sorrow. Dr. Renner closed the folder and looked out toward the trees where the bear had stood. This was not a case of an animal behaving strangely. This was something deeper, something rooted in memory, in grief, and maybe even in understanding. The truth was not just hidden in the past, it was alive in the present, walking quietly through the woods beside a man who had suffered just as she had. Elias never asked the bear to stay, she had simply come and never left. But over time, her presence had become part of his world, as natural as the sunrise and the shifting winds. He never tried to tame her, and she never tried to come closer than she needed. Yet between them, something unseen had formed, not trust in the ordinary sense, but a quiet understanding, a bond that asked for nothing and gave everything. He began to notice the way she moved, not just with caution, but with weight. There was a tiredness in her steps, a sadness that clung to her movements like dust to an old coat. Some evenings, she sat not at the edge of the field but near a small tree where the soil had been disturbed years ago. Elias remembered that spot, it had once held a den, a shallow space beneath the roots. He had filled it in one spring after finding it abandoned. Now, he wondered if it had once belonged to her. Her eyes told the rest of the story. When the wind was still and the stars came out, he sometimes caught her looking at the sky in the same way he did, as if both of them were searching for someone they could no longer touch. There was no anger in her expression, no threat, only sorrow, the kind that doesn't roar or rage, but sits quietly beside you like a shadow. One morning, Elias found the remains of a small bundle of fur near the tree line. It was old, nearly dust, but he knew what it was, a cub, perhaps more than one. And suddenly, everything made sense. Around the same time his family had been taken from him, she too had lost hers. Whether it had been the storm, hunger, or something else, he would never know, but the loss was there, in her bones, in the way she carried herself, with a mother's ache that had never healed. Elias began to see their bond not as chance but as something deeper, two souls drawn together by shared pain. He spoke to her sometimes, not expecting an answer, but offering words like small bridges between their worlds. He told her of Daniel, of Miriam, of the days when laughter filled the house. And though the bear made no sound, she listened. Her ears twitched at his voice, her head tilted slightly when he spoke names filled with memory. The villagers watched from a distance, no longer afraid, but still uncertain. They saw the man and the bear side by side and began to understand. This was not a wild animal staking claim, this was grief finding grief, a mother without her cubs, a father without his child, both walking through life with the same wound hidden in different shapes. There were no grand displays, no touching moments, no loud declarations, only silence, shared space, and the gentle rhythm of two broken hearts learning how to beat again beside one another. The truth did not spread all at once, it trickled through the village like the first signs of spring. People spoke in hushed voices, sharing what the biologist had discovered and what Elias himself had begun to reveal. The idea that the bear was not a threat but a quiet mourner, like Elias, was difficult to accept at first, but slowly, One by one, the villagers began to see with new eyes. They watched her from afar and saw no signs of danger, no aggression, no fear, only stillness. They began to understand the way she appeared at the same time each day and left when the air cooled. She never wandered through the village or disturbed livestock. She stayed near the field, near Elias, as if keeping a silent promise. Even the children stopped fearing her. They whispered stories, not of a beast in the woods, but of a guardian who had chosen to stay with a lonely man. It was the village elder who first suggested they do something more, not to trap her, not to drive her away, but to protect her. She had become a part of their story too, and they could no longer pretend she was just passing through. So, the villagers gathered tools and wood and, without any great announcement, began to build near the edge of Elias's field, just before the forest began. They cleared a small space. A circle of soft soil was framed with a low wooden fence, not to hold her in, but to mark the area as hers. They placed stones around it, smooth and clean, and added a small basin of water carved from an old trough. It wasn't much, but it was enough, a sign that she was welcome. Elias watched them work with quiet eyes. He said very little, but when the space was finished, he walked to the fence, placed his hand gently on the wood, and nodded. That evening, when the bear appeared, she walked to the new area, sniffed the air, and sat inside it without hesitation. She looked out across the field at Elias, then settled into the soft earth, her body heavy and calm. No one disturbed her. Some villagers came to watch from a respectful distance, but no one got too close. They had seen enough to know this was not a place for noise or excitement. This was something sacred, a symbol of what could be when fear was set aside and wounds were allowed to breathe. The bear was no longer a mystery. She was a story, a lesson, a piece of the land's history. Where once there had been fear, there was now quiet reverence. Mothers brought their children to see her, fathers pointed her out in the evenings, and even the oldest among them whispered prayers of peace when they passed by. In honoring her, they had begun to heal a part of themselves too. The bear had never spoken, yet somehow she had taught them all how to listen. The seasons passed as they always did. The fields turned from green to gold to white and back again, and through them all, the bear continued her silent visits. Each evening, she emerged from the woods, walking more slowly each time. Her fur had begun to gray around the muzzle, and her steps had grown stiff, but still, she came, always at dusk, always to the same place. Elias had aged too. His beard had turned silver, and his hands trembled more than before, but his eyes remained steady. He continued to work his land, though less than he once did. He spent more time sitting on the porch, watching the edge of the forest, waiting for her shape to appear. Some days she came later, some days not at all, but he never stopped looking. Then came the evening that felt different. The air was still, the sky soft with pale clouds. The bear appeared as she always had, but this time, she did not sit in the clearing. She walked farther across the field and slowly made her way toward the house. Elias rose from his chair and stepped down to meet her. She stopped near the old garden and laid down. Her breaths were deep and slow, her eyes soft with tiredness. Elias sat beside her in the grass. Without a word, they stayed that way as the sun dipped low, the sky painted in fading gold. No one else was there, only the farmer and the bear, two old souls bound by memory and quiet love. When morning came, the bear was gone, not back into the woods, not down the road, just gone, as if the forest itself had come to take her home. Elias searched gently, but he knew she had made her final visit. He did not weep. Instead, he took a small sapling from his garden and planted it in the very spot where she had rested. He placed a stone beside it and carved two simple shapes into it, a bear and a heart. He watered the soil every day and watched the tree take root and rise. The villagers came to see it. Some brought flowers, others brought quiet prayers. Over time, the tree grew strong, its branches wide and full. Children played beneath it, lovers carved their names into the bark, and old men sat nearby, remembering days long gone. They called it the Tree of Two Hearts, a place where sorrow met peace, a place where a wild creature and a grieving man taught an entire village what it meant to love without fear and to heal without words. And so, their story lived on, not just in memory, but in roots, leaves, and quiet evening skies. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect on the bonds that form when we least expect them. For more heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to our channel. Every story brings us closer to the beauty of the world we live in. Stay with us for more.